Good evening, APUSH, and welcome to the last review. I'm here with your fuse to shield you from the dark side of failure. Yep, where are you?
I'm here.
All right, I think I'm either going to launch into like a temper tantrum, or, wow, that mask was really hot. I can see why Kylo Ren took that off. Okay, so welcome everybody to the last review. Happy Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with everyone who's here. And so here we are to help you get through your APUSH exam. We're going to be taking questions through Twitter. Now, I hope once I can get this lightsaber off here. All right, so as far as that goes, this is going to be mainly Q&A focused. Now, if you are watching on YouTube, of course, there's the option of watching at tomrichey.net/hangouts. Okay, so let me just show you what we've got here. Just got a few things for you. Okay, now, first of all, a link to my APUSH review page that's got all kinds of stuff, court case handout, some things about how to take the test, all of that kind of stuff, describing that. And then review videos for every period from myself, Mr. Betts' class, Keith, Daniel Joe's. So everything here, it's kind of loading right now, but lots of stuff there. It'll take a little bit to load. It's a really big page, but you see here, discovery and settlement. So sometimes I'll direct you to stuff that's on this page. And, we've got period reviews from Daniel Joe's. We've got, all kinds of things there for period 3. So basically we can take you through a whole review here. Now, also there are some notes here and there. For example, like, I don't really get to focus a lot on period 8. So what I've done is I've made my students some period 8 notes. Okay. And these are very, very extensive, going through the Cold War and going into the presidents in the Cold War, going into the Civil Rights Acts and all of that kind of stuff, foreign policy, liberalism versus conservatism, the Civil Rights Acts. So, just all kinds of things here to help you out. So we've got some period 8 notes there. I've got my video on Nixon's foreign policy. All kinds of things. And then I've got period 9 notes as well. So those of you who need like a little period 8, period 9 help, there you go. And so as far as that goes, that's one thing I've got for you. Now, another thing, of course, is my Romulus app. Now, I've got a lot of stuff about how to take the APUSH exam. The Romulus app is a pretty simple trivia app, okay? It's basically a rapid fire, like putting stuff in front of you, getting a whole bunch of content in you. Some people don't really understand. They're not stimulus-based questions. The reason for this is to help you on your DBQs, LEQs, SAQs, where you have to produce information on demand. Okay. And the best way to do that is to review. You can be using this. It's very convenient. Even right before the AP exam, you can be using this. So that's the thing. I mean, just a simple trivia app. If you're interested, great. If you don't need it, you don't need it. We're certainly going to be giving you plenty of stuff here. Also, after this is over, I'm going to have a little fireside chat. Now, if you're on the East Coast, you need to go to bed. But some of you like the idea of having just a smaller group kind of conversation. So this is limited. Only not more than 50 people can sign up for this. After that, it's full. So I'm going to make sure that I'm reviewing with a smaller group, going to be able to answer everybody's questions. Now, as far as this goes, make sure that you are asking questions on Twitter and use the hashtag #TheLastReview. Okay, use the hashtag #TheLastReview on Twitter. Okay, so as far as that goes, just a few things to help you out. And Keith and I are going to be taking questions. And of course, on Twitter, followers have priority. There are a lot of questions going to be coming at us. We've got over 2,000 people watching right now, 3,000 people rather. I was reading that wrong. So lots of questions coming out. Now, remember, later the fireside chat's going to be a smaller group thing, but we're going to be here for about the next 2 hours, and we're going to be taking questions. Now, Keith is already drawing on the big board. Keith, do you already have something going?
Hey guys, just a little bit. We just want to make sure you know Twitter handles, so they're up there. Hashtag last review. That's mainly how we're going to handle this. There's just so much to cover. We really want to take questions, try to cover as much as we can, rather than trying to run through the course like a crazy person. That doesn't make any sense. What I want to show you guys just really, really quick, if I share my screen with you guys, is if you guys go to hiphughes.com, which is right here. Let's move my screen around a little bit. Here we go. Bam, bam, bam. There's a video arsenal. So all I'm going to show you is if you click that video arsenal, you guys know what you don't know, right? So if you go into that U.S. history course, of course, the Constitution might help you as well. And elections, especially every single election that we've ever had, except for the last one, which I can't do yet, is there for your viewing pleasure, as well as the entire, at least basic U.S. history course. You won't find everything, but there's about 150 videos. So we'll stop talking at this point because we want to get to the good stuff. So I will stop talking. As Tom is talking, I'm going to be looking through those Twitter questions. So again, make sure you follow us. We'll look through the last review, pick a couple questions out, and then when I'm doing that, Tom will be responding and looking for questions. We want to make this work for you because we love you. All right, Tom.
That's right. That's right. POV us. You know, we're you know, you're watching our channel. Of course, we love you, right? Now, the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, Clark, Texas in the house. Linux APUSH. Thank y'all for coming. Been supporting me a long time. Now, OMG2Fab number 4 U, letter U. Now, as far as that goes, somebody's saying, what is your educated prediction on what the DBQ could possibly be, and what synthesis point would you use for it? This is a great example of what not to do. Okay, don't try to game the exam or go in there with expectations, because the exam is by nature unpredictable. And that's one thing to note, that like, okay, a couple years ago, the first year they did the redesign, they did the exam, like the DBQ was on the rise of the conservative movement. And so conventional wisdom says, oh, well, surely they won't do a post-World War II DBQ again. And sure enough, they did a post-World War II DBQ last year on the post-World War II women's movement. And so while we may think like, oh, no way they're going to do that, well, they'll do it. And we might say, oh, well, they couldn't do it 3 years in a row. So the thing is, I think it's very important that, you know, you're not trying to what I call game the exam. You want to be generally prepared. The other thing is the DBQ. I've got some videos on the DBQ. I've got rubrics there. You should be able to score 4 or 5 points on the DBQ at least, even if you hate the topic. That's the beauty of the DBQ, is that even if the topic sucks, even if it's awful, you can still do well on it if you know what you're doing. So concentrate on the format of the DBQ, and remember that synthesis, you can't decide synthesis until you see the prompt. Synthesis is not topical. Synthesis is about extending your argument. So if it doesn't extend the central argument, if it doesn't, like, you know, if it doesn't push like the thesis into another place or time. Now, here's the thing about synthesis. Your general synthesis will be basically that it's happening outside the time or place. Now, place is horizontal synthesis. If you've had AP Euro, which I didn't have a chance to change my shirt. I guess I'm being ironic tonight or something like that, or representing the dark side of AP Euro. I don't know. But the thing is that when it comes to, you know, when it comes to synthesis, you're either using horizontal synthesis, a different place. So if you've taken AP Euro or AP World, then you could use something from there if it relates. It does not have to be U.S. history. You can also use vertical synthesis, which is time. Now, you can go another time and another place, or another time or another place, but it has to happen outside of the scope of the prompt. Now, one of the easiest ways to do synthesis that I know of is called PS synthesis. And this won't work as well if it's a post-World War II thing, but if you're doing something that's not post-World War II, just basically move your argument out of that period, like continue your argument, like just basically have another paragraph where you're noting how here's how it was during the following period. And you have performed synthesis. You have extended your argument. So that PS synthesis is really, to me, a really good one. Now, remember, with synthesis, you're setting up a general historical principle. So here's an example of this, but really it has to go with your thesis. Okay, so when it comes down to it, you know, it could be about the Civil War, but what aspect of the Civil War? So this is the thing. It's like, unfortunately for some of you, you're going to have to think on this exam. That's the whole point. So don't go, I mean, go in there studying, knowing as much content as you can. That's where my Romulus app will help you as far as having those things that like got that. But as far as the synthesis, you know, you've really got to use some critical thinking in order to produce that. So I think that that is very important there as far as, as far as looking into that. That we want to make sure that we're not trying, because the thing is, you may like the question, you may not. Now, another thing is on the DBQ and the LEQ. Remember, always do the DBQ first, because that's 25% of the exam versus 15% of the exam. And so do the DBQ first, because that is the big kicker. And even if the DBQ is awful, you can still do it if you know the format. Now, one thing that I say as well, as far as time allocation, I would say the first thing you do is just look at the LEQs real quick and decide right at the beginning, these LEQs, like this is going to be a great one. Pick your LEQ topic. This is going to be a great one. This is going to be okay, or I'm going to be lucky to get 2 points on this. Now, the thing is that when the College Board recommends allocations for time, they say 55 minutes on the DBQ and 35 minutes for the LEQ. Now, you need 35 minutes if you're going to write a great LEQ. But if you've realized that, like, whoa, these LEQ topics are, okay, not good, then you know that, like, okay, well, now I might want to spend an hour or an hour 10. I generally tell people spend an hour on the DBQ, half an hour on the LEQ. It's just a nice, it's just a nice, easy divide. But if you realize that, like, look, that LEQ, I've got nothing or I've got very little, make sure you make up for that on the DBQ, because what you're trying to do here to pass the exam is to have points. All right. You want to have as many points as possible on this exam. So make sure that you're thinking about that point allocation. Now on the SAQs, do your strongest one first and then progress to your weakest one. So, you got 50 minutes. What I tell students is use 2 minutes to just look at them, check them out, and decide which one's your best one, your second best, your third best, and the one that you're lucky to get any points on at all. And hopefully, and that's the thing that, as far as that goes, put your best foot forward and then go with that. Now, multiple choice, do them all in order. Thank y'all. The number of people in here is growing. So thank y'all for telling your friends and all of that. So, glad to see the number in here growing. And remember, tomrichey.net/hangouts, and then at hiphughes.com, we've got other things for you to help you, prepare for this exam. So that was like some test taking tips and that sort of thing. Keith, are you ready to handle a question or two on content?
Maybe a couple questions. Let me do 2 questions for you. Hannah asks, shout out to Hannah S, asking about Bacon's Rebellion. So we can spend a lot of time getting a little feedback here.
Okay, while you correct that feedback, let me give a shout out real quick to Clara and Mr. Demler, and also to Caitlin Carroll and Mrs. Dean's APUSH class. They're all watching. Thank y'all so much. All right, Keith, you got it?
I think so. So Hannah asked about Bacon's Rebellion. So I just wanted to give a real short synopsis kind of what Bacon's Rebellion is. We can't spend a lot of time on every piece of content, but Bacon's Rebellion is really kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to be coming 100 years down the road. It's actually, I believe, like 100 years pretty much from the Revolution, 1676, right around there. And really down in the colonies in Jamestown, you have William Berkeley. He's in charge. He's kind of the aristocrat. He's the upper echelon. He represents Great Britain's wishes, and they're playing for themselves, just like they're going to be doing all throughout kind of this colonial period. So when it comes to the everyday existence of people like Nathaniel Bacon, who's not so rich, who's kind of on the western frontier a little bit, and he's seeing the policies not representing his interests, and he sees that his brothers and his sisters, well, maybe not his sisters back then, but indentured servants and people that are poor, they're losing their qualification to vote, they're being taxed, he sees unfairly, and the big thing is the Native Americans, that the British aren't really protecting them as in their eyes from the Native Americans, that they're dealing with them, trade and all that. So basically it's an uprising. It's going to get squashed. It's going to get creamed, but it is going to have some consequences. The governor's going to lose his job, but I think the bigger consequences is that they're going to listen a little bit. They're going to listen a little bit. And as a result of that, they're also going to move more towards a system of slavery. Because when you have indentured servants and you have people that feel left out, they feel like they never can get ahead. They feel like the others, sometimes that might cause some resistance and some fight back. So Bacon's Rebellion is kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come in terms of the American Revolution. One more really quick one I'm going to do is Amber asked about Nixon and foreign policy. And we could talk forever about this, but just to get the basic idea down, I've always in my head thought of Nixon kind of blowing on his hand. It's the stupidest way to remember it. But I always remember that, you know, before Nixon, it's not like the Cold War is going to go away, by the way, but the Cold War is raging in the 50s and the 60s. You have all of those events from, you know, the building of the Berlin Wall and the Berlin Airlift and the Marshall Plan, and then you have Vietnam and you have Korea. You have all this going on. It's hot. It's real hot. So this is detente. How do you say that word, Tom? Say it for me one time so I know I'm saying it right.
I usually say detente, which is kind of like not detention.
I think I have Native American blood, so I say detente. But I'll say detente. But either way, the comment is you're cooling off the Cold War. You're blowing down that fire a little bit. So whether you're talking about the SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation treaties, so instead of building weapons, we're kind of taking it down a notch, or we're opening up China. Those are two really great examples of détente, ending the Vietnam War, trying to get out of that mess, and trying to take it down a notch so American foreign policy isn't always ramped up at DEFCON 5, and we can start sometimes dealing with our enemies to make the world a better place and to protect the self-interest of the United States. Whatever foreign policy you're writing about, my brothers and my sisters, you want to always remember that the main idea is whatever we're doing it because in our mind, it protects our self-interest. All foreign nations, all nations in the world have that thesis, but you always want to connect what we're doing to how it helps either the domestic or the foreign wants and needs of the United States of America. So détente, blow on your hand, Bacon's Rebellion, grab a rifle, and you're good to go. I'm going to go to the Twitter feed, Tom. Here I go.
All right. Okay, does that mean... Whose turn is it, Keith?
Your turn.
Oh, my turn. Okay. Well,
yeah, I'm going to look through Twitter for another one. I'll do two at a time.
Okay, let's see.
All right. I'm against the House of Tom.
All right. Taylor had a good question, not following. Let's see if we can find a follower here. All right. Let's see. The Albany Plan of Union. Okay. So that's Jaja line or whatever. Yaya line, whatever. It's a written test. The Albany Plan of Union. This is something that was from the French and Indian War. And they're thinking about how can we get the colonies to work together. Okay. So it didn't actually happen. It's just, okay, here's a plan. But it was the first attempt to unite the colonies together in some kind of collective action, which really didn't happen during the French and Indian War. So the chief value of the Albany Plan of Union is that it foreshadowed what was going to happen later. Terra's APUSH 17, my favorite group here, one of my favorites. I got a lot of favorites. The Korean and Vietnam wars. Okay. Now, as far as the Korean War, all right. So, you've got similar things here in the sense that you've got the communist North, the anti-communist South, and the United States, of course, with this policy of containment. The United States is committed to not allowing communism to spread, whether that be in Europe or Asia or Latin America. Now, of course, containment in Europe was perfect record. Containment in Asia, and then containment in Latin America, mostly successful. I mean, Cuba's not like a huge Latin American country. It's not like Brazil went full on communist or something like that. But as far as that goes, the United States and the Korean War. Now, the Korean War was the first time that the UN actually took military action because the Soviets didn't, the Soviets boycotted something. And then, of course, the UN still recognized Taiwan as China. So, Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman. Now, that was one thing, Truman, used some restraint. Now, Truman had to get involved here because when China fell, people thought, well, Truman soft on communism. So Truman's going to make sure South Korea doesn't fall. But remember, containment policy. Truman's goal is basically to protect South Korea. Now, he gets into it with Douglas MacArthur. There's no substitute for victory, Douglas MacArthur said. Of course, when he had the Incheon landing, it was brilliant. But MacArthur said, if we've got to use nuclear weapons, whatever we've got to do to win this war, not go to some stalemate and armistice or something like that. And so basically that ended with an armistice. Now, the thing about the Korean War is that South Korea is still a U.S. allied democratic free market country today. Now, Vietnam is a little bit of another story. Now, at first, the United States was trying to help France keep Vietnam. Now, this goes back into containment policy. In the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, the United States is trying to help France keep Vietnam because they're fighting against the Viet Minh, under Ho Chi Minh. And this group is, they might be communist. And we're not so sure about these people. So the United States wants France to, to continue to be, there, to continue to control that. Now, that doesn't work. And then the United States then sends military advisors to South Vietnam. Okay, so the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese are democratic, free market, Western aligned. And, as far as that goes, the United States gets involved there. And at first, under Kennedy, advisors, okay, a small scale kind of thing. Remember, Kennedy was about developing our potential for limited war. The Cuban Missile Crisis really did a number on him. It's like after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was like, whew, maybe we don't want to be like so quick to provoke a possible nuclear war or something like that. And so he's focusing on limited war. Now, of course, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where the USS Maddox was allegedly attacked, we're not sure. My professor at Clemson actually wrote a book on it and thinks that the ship was actually not attacked. But Congress issues the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, Korea and Vietnam were both undeclared wars, okay, where basically the president is just authorized by Congress to act. We kind of give up on declaring war after World War II. And so the Gulf of Tonkin resolution basically gives Lyndon Johnson a blank check, which that's not the kind of check that Madison had in mind, with the, when he designed the Constitution. The check is supposed to be, you're supposed to keep an eye on the president. And so you give the president a blank check, and next thing we know, we've got 500,000 men in this remote Southeast Asian country, 60,000 dead Americans. And in 1968, the Tet Offensive is a turning point. Whereas that's a military victory for the United States, it was a PR nightmare because, the media was, of course, there. And, they saw these gruesome images. They saw the coffins coming in and all of that. And so, as far as this is concerned, the public turns against this war, which if you want a synthesis opportunity here, if you think about the Civil War with the North versus the South, there were a lot of people before the Vietnam War who subscribed to the thesis that there's no way the South could have won. But basically, the North Vietnamese did what the Confederate States of America would have had to do to win the war, which would have been basically to stop the, with the Confederacy, to stop the North from basically to persuade the North that it's not worth it. And so what happened here is the United States wasn't defeated militarily in Vietnam, but the public lost the will to fight the war, and the U.S. had to pull out, even when they were in a superior military position. Now, afterwards, Congress, the same Congress that passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, they passed the War Powers Act, which was to rein in the president and the power of the president to say, okay, if you deploy troops, 2 days, you got to inform Congress. No more of this Nixon sending troops to Cambodia or whatever. You got to inform Congress. And after 60 days, Congress must authorize the military force. So it gives the president some leeway, but, still, keeps Congress in an oversight role. Now, another thing to note is, stuff like the Pentagon Papers, when the New York Times got a hold of those, and it really eroded trust in the government. Okay. There was this really, you've got Watergate, you've got the Pentagon Papers. So that's one thing that, trust in government starts to go down, which somebody was asking about the conservative movement. And that's part of that. It's like people stop trusting government. And that is really one of that's at the core of the conservative movement. You think about Reagan, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So, when you see this, it's like a lot of factors are playing into the rise of the conservative movement, which we may address a little more directly later. But for that, I'm going to go back to Keith and see what he's got for us.
Yeah, really great talk on Vietnam. And Robert McNamara had a documentary not long ago, and it was a really great documentary, kind of Fog of War. I don't know if you've seen it, Tom. But pointing out that 2 million, we killed 2 million Vietnamese. We lost 60,000. So when you start to compare those numbers and you start to look at who had the intent to win, he really boiled it down to the idea that we were fighting a Cold War battle, and they were fighting a battle of independence, and that you're always going to fight harder when you're fighting for your independence than if you're fighting for some ideological idea that's far away from you. But really great talk on Vietnam. Let's go back old school for Taylor, asking about the feds and the anti-feds. So if we want to really boil it down, because really that's the beginning of the formation of the political parties, right? The Federalist Party, which is actually called the Federalist Party when they're around, is going to be one party, and those anti-feds are going to evolve into the Democratic Republicans and then eventually split into the Democratic Party. So understanding really what they believed in is to understand the beginning of the evolution of the two-party system. So, of course, the feds and the anti-feds really begin to identify themselves like that during the Constitutional Convention. If you remember, right, the Articles of Confederation, which is our first constitution, was set up right during the battles, like during the Revolution. So there's a great fear of central government. We do not want, even though the Articles of Confederation is federalism. Remember, guys, federalism is the division of power between the feds and the states. The Articles of Confederation, very weak for the central government. You have no president. You have no power to tax. You have no court system. You have no ability to gather an army up and defend the country. But you can understand why. And you always want to remember that there's a reason why. And that's because we're coming out of that relationship with Great Britain and we don't trust power. So when that doesn't work, and remember, the Articles of Confederation were tossed in the trash. We just started over because in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, to change it, you needed unanimous consent. And that was, pretty much impossible to do. And even to pass a law, you needed 9 out of the 13 states to agree. So when that becomes apparent, it's not going to work, and they will go back and start over. There are a lot of Americans that are really kind of fishy about this whole experience of writing a constitution. What's going to happen here? Are we going to have a new central government that's going to represent, authority and power and take away my liberty all over again? So the feds are the ones that are arguing that the problems with the articles need to be corrected with a stronger central government. These are our Alexander Hamiltons. They want a banking system. They want to be able to control the economy, to defend the borders. They want a nation, like a real nation for real. And the anti-feds are consistently thinking about those, fears of power, going back to kind of John Locke and the very essence of why we have government, limited government. So, of course, the feds are going to win the day. The anti-feds are eventually going to get the ratification of the Bill of Rights, which is going to give them enough, enough cover to, say, at least we can protect ourselves with these Bill of Rights from any abuses or tyranny that might evolve with this new federal government. And then, of course, like I said before, we get the feds, we get the strength of the Washington regime and the Adams regime. And then we see with the Democratic Republicans, more of a states' rights focus. So that's really, really important. So we hope we answered your questions on the feds and the anti-feds. Laissez-faire, right? We had Megan asked about laissez-faire. I love saying laissez-faire. I'm going to say it 3 times just because it's the best word to say. Laissez-faire, laissez-faire, laissez-faire. Really simple, guys. We're just going to go with the idea that it's a basic concept that government should keep its hands out of the economy to allow some supply and demand and market forces to make it run more smoothly. When you start to interfere, this is the idea behind kind of libertarianism and a laissez-faire economic system, is that when you regulate, when you try to fix something, you're actually getting in the way of economic growth. So it's best to kind of a hands-off approach. This is best illustrated probably through the Gilded Age. And then the other side is going to say, the progressive side is going to say, well, there's consequences of being laissez-faire. And those consequences might be a danger to society. There might not be regulation for pollution, or it might be unsafe in the workplace. But the very basic idea, laissez-faire, is hands-off government to allow the economy to grow. So I'm going to go back to the Twitter. You guys need to keep #TheLastReview. Follow me and Tom. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. So now's a good time to tweet. I bet Tom's got one that he's ready to hit out of the park.
All right. Yes, I've got a few here. Now, there are some great Twitter handles out there. We've got Kung Fu Kenny, Mrs. Sheeran, XOXO. I have no idea what all that means together. What is Reaganomics? Okay, now Reaganomics is this idea that that basically, now of course we've seen stuff before, Keynesian economics. Let me go ahead and talk about Keynesian economics, because that comes into fashion during the New Deal. Now, before the New Deal, classical economics were dominant. You know, you think about like Adam Smith. And Hip Hughes was just talking about laissez-faire. He says it a lot better than I do. But, you know, he was talking about, you know, laissez-faire and, of course, the idea that the budget should be balanced and all that kind of stuff. Well, John Maynard Keynes, he said, you know, if the economy's bad, then what you need to do is deficit spend. Now, two ways you can deficit spend. Now, you can go with tax cuts, you can lower taxes, and you can take a temporary hit, and the economy will go up. Or the government can spend on shovel-ready projects, okay? Basically projects that are ready to go right now that somebody can, you know, infrastructure and stuff like that, roads, bridges, buildings. And so Keynesian economics, now during the New Deal, you know, FDR used Keynesian economics, now not tax cuts, but the government spending. Now remember that government spending was really not effective in bringing the economy back. It wasn't until Europeans started killing each other and needed stuff from us that, you know, unemployment went down, GDP went up. But really, you know, the United States stagnated through. Now, you know, FDR did a great job with relief, made a lot of reforms, but the recovery really wasn't that successful. Now, John F. Kennedy used Keynesian economics with a tax cut. You know, taxes were very high when Kennedy was president. And he said, you know what, let's use tax cuts to stimulate the economy. Now, Reaganomics is basically, you know, it's not Keynesian, but, you know, because he doesn't believe in government spending, he wants less, at least domestic spending. Now, remember the military spending, like offset, you know, basically Reagan comes in and you increase, you cut taxes. You know, you increase military spending. Now, of course, Reagan never really got the domestic spending cuts he wanted, so you had big deficits. But the essence of Reaganomics is that if, you know, if taxes and, you know, if taxes are above a certain point, then it's inefficient, okay? That basically you can lower taxes and it will not only stimulate the economy, but it'll also result in more revenue. Now, also part of Reaganomics is a lot of times, like now opponents of Reaganomics call it trickle down economics, okay? Because basically there's this idea of the rich getting tax cuts, okay? Which, you know, when you look at these tax cuts, you know, they apply to everybody, but there are some people that would like to see only the middle class. And, you know, the struggling people get tax cuts rather than the rich getting tax cuts as well. So Reaganomics is fueled by the idea that it's like, look, the rich need to have money to invest because they're the job creators. They're the ones who create jobs. Now, of course, you get into partisan interpretations of that, but that is the essence of Reaganomics. Cut everybody's taxes, you know, even the wealthy, and especially the wealthy, because that's going to come down to everybody, that prosperity will, you know, will spread out when you cut taxes. So that's the essence of that. Now, Jacksonian democracy, you know, Radha Patel, as far as that goes, Jacksonian democracy, remember before Andrew Jackson, typically only, and it's not like Jackson did this, Jackson was kind of the personification. He just was in the right place, the right time, came to represent it. That Jacksonian democracy, you know, changes things, because before 1824 and 1828 especially, most of the people who voted in elections were property owners. And a lot of times the presidential electors, like in the very earliest elections, the United States had what I would call an aristocratic republic, okay? Not a democratic republic, but an aristocratic republic where the people who held power were landowners, okay? They were rich landowners. And if you owned property, you could vote. The state legislature would choose presidential electors. Well, what happens is, you know, around the time of the presidency of Andrew Jackson, you start to see more states. Now, of course, when you think about Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier thesis, you know, the frontier, Turner wrote that the frontier has always been a force changing and democratizing America. So in the Western states, because people went west because they didn't have anything. And so every man got to vote. Every white male got to vote in like Tennessee and Kentucky. And what happened, you know, in Ohio, that started to spread east, that it's like, you know, why does the common man get to vote? And there is this emphasis on also the self-made man, that Jackson represents this guy that was born into poverty, that learned the law, that got a military commission. Next thing you know, he's got a, you know, huge slave plantation, and he's a general and then the president. And he wasn't born into a privileged background. Like before Jackson, you know, everybody who had been president had been from some kind of aristocratic background and had had considerable experience in public life. And so Jackson represents a change here. So the politics, now another thing about Jacksonian democracy is personal campaigning, that Jefferson never ran for president. You know, during Jefferson's time, you don't do that. Now Jackson's time, very much so. And that of course turns into negative campaigning and all of that. So all kinds of stuff there for Jacksonian democracy. Now, when you think about Jackson's party, remember Jackson's party was also very laissez-faire, states' rights, very Jeffersonian. Like, so the first party system and the second party system, a lot of the issues are similar. It's like, if you think about Jackson as kind of the new Jefferson and Clay as kind of like the new Hamilton and Adams, then you've got that with the Democrats and the Whigs, which is why some people refer to Jefferson's party as the Democratic Republican Party, because they see like Jackson's party kind of coming from that same tradition. All right. So Keith, what you got for us?
Sure, we'll do a couple. Let's see. Jenna just asked a great question, just a general about Reconstruction and really presidential Reconstruction versus Congressional Reconstruction. So just to remind everybody, of course, we're talking about the period right after the Civil War from what, about 1865, 1866 to about 1877. You can actually mark the end of Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877 or the Great Betrayal. But basically, the way that I always taught it, and sometimes I would be a little bit silly, I don't want to say dumb it down, but give you just a nice visual way to remember the concept. I used to teach this as hugs and slugs, because the basic concept was, if you're viewing the war from the Lincoln perspective or the Andrew Johnson perspective, really the mission is save the Union. That's the mission. So once you make the other side say uncle, once they've, you know, put the white flag in the air, you've kind of won your objective. So in a sense, you want to hug the South, bring her back into the Union. I used to use a kind of like a marriage divorce analogy. So in a sense, you're trying to save the marriage. And if the woman or the man finally says, okay, maybe I love you, I'll come back home, get their butt back home. Give them a big smoochie and make up. And that's kind of that easier, you know, Reconstruction plan that comes out of Lincoln and Johnson. We were talking about, I think it was like a 10% loyalty oath, just the 13th Amendment, not talking about suffrage, not talking about equal citizenry and all of that jazz, as opposed to Congress, who's mad, who's upset. They want to punish the South. They don't want it ever to happen again. And they think the best way to do that is to make sure that not only do you punish them, but you occupy them. That military occupation, that if we just go back to the way things were, they're going to come back to this point again. So having military occupation is going to cause a whole bunch of host of problems for both sides in the long run. But that's really that hug and slug concept. Slug them with the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, military occupation, 50% loyalty oath, as opposed to those easier presidential plans. Of course, you also want to mark the end of Reconstruction with the election of 1876. That's Tilden Hayes. Tilden is the Northern Democrat. Get out of town. Hayes is the Republican. And Tilden probably won that election. But at the end of the day, it's an electoral kind of toss-up. I think Florida, Louisiana, I think that's the two states that eventually are going to be kind of slid over to the Hayes column. And kind of the payback is we'll remove those troops. So, you know, obviously, Southerners who don't want these, you know, carpetbaggers in their land ruling them are going to be really happy. But that also means you're going to have a lack of protection for those millions of freed slaves, now citizens that are going to be living in there, trying to vote, trying to live their lives, not having the protection of those northern armies. So hugs and slugs, very basic idea about Reconstruction. Alexa had a question about Kansas.
Now, one thing, Keith, can I kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that.
Yeah. Let's kind of, you know, while we're on like the Civil War and Reconstruction, just want to note like those differences in the Republican Party, you know, because like he was talking about with Lincoln, you know, it's like from that more moderate faction of the Republican Party. And so Rutherford B. Hayes, like that's one thing to note here is that when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected, like Ulysses S. Grant supported radical Reconstruction. And so then when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected, this is really back to the triumph of the Lincoln wing of the Republican Party. So the Compromise of 1877, it's not like anybody wrote anything down. It was just almost an understanding. But remember that it's like basically Rutherford B. Hayes, when he pulls the last of the troops out, it's like, I mean, he's really kind of implementing what Lincoln's original vision of Reconstruction was.
I'll agree with that, but the consequences are the same. I'll agree with that analysis, but the consequence for those African Americans that are left there, whoever's fault it is, are going to be dire, and that's going to last for decades and decades and decades.
You want to hit on Jim Crow real quick while we're there?
Certainly, we can throw in some Jim Crow. Jim Crow, obviously. Well, not obviously, if you don't know what it is, but please don't think Jim Crow's a real person. Jim Crow was actually a minstrel character, but it's just the characterization in the name for the social, the political, the legal system of kind of racism that held African Americans back during that period. And not just directly after Reconstruction. Many of those state laws that are going to be most kind of connected with Jim Crow are going to be at the turn of the century in 1905, 1910, 1915. But any way that you want to cut it, Jim Crow is the complete system. On a social level, that means segregation. So that means, segregated water fountains and movie theaters. And also, I try to get this across to my kids that it's really hard to put into words the lost opportunity. I used to point out that the worst consequence of Jim Crow, maybe this was because I was white, I didn't always associate with the physical violence, the lynchings by the Klan or the terrorism by the Klan to stop people from voting. I always kind of associate it, maybe because I'm an historian and an idea guy, with that scientist that never got to be a scientist and discover something, or that artist that never got to paint that painting because they were never allowed to have that opportunity like all other Americans that didn't face that kind of discrimination. So what we lost from Jim Crow as a country, with our culture, with our laws, with our science, that's kind of something that I can't express, but I think we all need to kind of think about. On a legal standpoint, if you want vocabulary, the easiest vocabulary to go for are the barriers to voting. So you're looking at literacy tests that were designed to try to keep African Americans from voting based on their ability to read. And maybe they weren't, given the same type of text as the white folk who came in. There was also poll taxes. That's not banned until the 24th Amendment in the 1960s. So that's an economic way of trying to stop poor people, African American poor people, from voting. And then you have the grandfather clause, where you were able to show that your grandfather voted. In some of those states, you were allowed to skip that literacy test and go right into the voting booth. But if you want to separate it into kind of social segregation, the terrorism of the Klan and the lynchings and the fear, the lost opportunity and the legal ramifications of not being able to vote. The country is founded on the idea of representation, of being a republic. And really, we have millions of our citizens for decades and decades and decades that don't have that representation. And that's going to have humongous effects on their ability to grow economically, for them to be able to pass down the things they could have done to their children, which affects generations and generations. But I'll leave it at that for Jim Crow. I have a really great video on Jim Crow. If you want to watch it later or put it into the side, see if you can do that. Really, really important. I've talked a long time. So
while you're on Jim Crow, there is an area where a lot of students get confused that I notice, okay? And that's because a lot of people confound Jim Crow with the Black Codes. And so one thing to note here is that the Black Codes happened during presidential Reconstruction, okay? So basically, remember, during presidential Reconstruction, Dred Scott was still the law of the land, okay? So basically, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it did not necessarily give African American citizenship. So the Black Codes were these laws passed by a lot of southern states that were saying, okay, well, if you're Black, then you're not a slave, but you've got a curfew, or you can't drink alcohol, or you can't carry a gun or a Bowie knife or something like that. And that's going on during presidential Reconstruction. Now, that is something that actually emboldens radical Republicans, because they're like, these rebels act like they won or something. And so that's going on beforehand. Now, of course, then you've got radical Reconstruction, where the 14th Amendment basically supersedes Jim Crow, okay? Like, I mean, not Jim Crow. See, I'm getting confused now. Supersedes Dred Scott, that really they amend Dred Scott out of the Constitution. And so when Dred Scott said that an African-American cannot be a citizen. So that's what you've got there. Now, of course, when radical Reconstruction is abandoned, then you have the Jim Crow system. So make sure that you understand that, you know, with the black codes, that is presidential Reconstruction. Jim Crow is after radical Reconstruction. And of course, last several decades, you know, what they call the nadir, the low point of American race relations. All right. So as far as that, let's see, Keith, where are we going?
Where do you want to go? I'm looking through. I'm going to pick one right now. How about Polk? I love Polk. I'm going to do just a really quick rundown on Polk, and then why don't you find a nice meaty topic to go over. But I love Polk because it's fun to say, and They Might Be Giants have a song about Polk. But one thing I wanted to say, there's a really great video out there, guys. When you're done with us, go watch Mr. Betts' class, American Rhapsody. He's taken Bohemian Rhapsody and summarized the course. It is pure awesomeness. Pure awesomeness. So for Polk, if you, again, you can't know everything about every president, but if you know you have that name, you want to kind of surround it with a concept. The concept really is, you know, I would say extreme manifest destiny, right? Polk is elected, what, 1845. He's kind of a protege of Andrew Jackson. I think he got in there by death. I'm going to look for Tom to nod. Am I right, William Henry Harrison?
William Henry Harrison, yeah, he died like a month after taking office.
So Polk wasn't really supposed to be president. And they really didn't, he was kind of unpredictable because he's a Southern Democrat now. He's president. He's a protege of Andrew Jackson. So really what he's responsible for is the annexation of Mexico, of Texas, and the Mexican War. But the bigger consequence, and this is the bigger idea, I think, behind that, is that really these are going to be the roots or the understreams of the Civil War, because we really haven't figured out this idea of what do we do with the expansion of slavery. You know, abolitionists exist. We're not going to say they didn't exist, but abolitionists aren't pulling the strings in the northern governments. The abolitionists are on the outside of the government screaming at the government. Even Lincoln isn't talking about the abolition of slavery when he's elected, right? This is something that comes later. But the appearance from the Southern viewpoint that, you know, they want to abolish slavery is probably what did the trick. But Polk doing that and not really knowing what's going to happen is going to create, in the long run, problems with the expansion of slavery and a firming up in the North of, not of abolitionism, but of the government's resolve to not let slavery spread. Really, you know, the free soil idea. Remember, the Free Soil Party is what becomes the Republican Party. So, you know, it's always a hard line to ride that the Republican Party, they're not for abolitionism, right? Some of them might be, but not as a platform. But they also believe in free soil, and they don't believe in the spreading of slavery. So Polk's administration is really going to create the conditions which are going to lead us into what do we do next? And that's going to lead us into the Compromise of 1850 and popular sovereignty and bleeding Kansas. And you know, if you look at it in hindsight, you can kind of see the dominoes falling. And I do think that Polk represents maybe one of those dominoes.
All right, and Keith, let me get to a few questions here. Now, Jonathan is asking, what is the significance of the city upon a hill? Now, this is where it's very important to note, as far as the people that are colonizing the 13 colonies, that you've got the New England, the Middle, the Southern colonies. All right, the New England colonies, this is largely about religion. Okay, this is a religious community. Then in the South, it's mainly to grow cash crops. In the middle colonies, you know, your New York, Pennsylvania, this is like the whole breadbasket, staple crops. Now, the Puritans and the Separatists, these English Calvinists, they had been persecuted in, in England, but they wanted to get out of there for quote unquote religious freedom. Now it was like their religious freedom. You know, it was like the freedom to have their own like religion based, almost utopian community and to make everybody go by their standards. Okay. So the city upon a hill, you know, that was Governor John Winthrop. And he said, look, that we are, the eyes of the world are upon us. Like basically, you know, everybody's looking like, what are those Puritans and Separatists, those crazy English Calvinists going to do? And so then, you know, it's like we have to be successful and we've got to create this religious commonwealth. And he gets this from the Bible, the idea of a city upon a hill. Now, what that comes down to, though, is you take somebody like Roger Williams, who said that we shouldn't compel somebody to observe a religion, and Anne Hutchinson, who, you know, was challenging the patriarchal authority of the church authorities, and, you know, she, you know, the clergy. And so Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, they were exiled. Roger Williams founded the First Baptist Church in America, which, of course, you know, the United States, you know, the Baptist churches are a very American thing. You know, they're very prevalent in the United States, and also where there's significant U.S. missionary activity, because you don't really see like Baptist churches in Europe, for example. And so that's something that is really kind of distinctly American. But the city upon a hill is like, look, we're all part of this religious community. And, you know, if anybody doesn't like it, they can get out of here. Now, Adri is asking, what exactly were the muckrakers? Okay, now the muckrakers, these were people who were investigative reporters, okay? Investigative reporters that are trying to uncover corruption. Now, the thing is, much like yellow journalism, now yellow journalism is basically circulation without a purpose, okay? Like with the Spanish-American War, Keith's got a great video on the Spanish-American War, by the way. You know, so just type in Spanish-American War into YouTube. And so when the Maine blows up, the yellow journalist papers, they're like, hey, we think Spain did this. And, you know, there's even one of the New York papers offers like a $50,000 reward, which was the equivalent of $1 million, you know, at that time. And so, you know, they're just, I mean, people are just buying this left and right, and they're just circulating papers with shameless, like, you know, attention grabbing headlines. Now, muckraking pieces tended to sell papers as well, which is why publishers like those sorts of things. So the muckrakers were out to expose corruption in government, in big business, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so they were out there exposing corruption. And so as far as that goes, you've got Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. Now, Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which is kind of like a composite fiction book, but there are two purposes that he was trying to put out there. First of all, your meat is nasty, okay? That the meat that you eat is, you know, just completely gross, because the way that they make this, you wouldn't believe it. Now, the other part of that is that, you know, I think Keith was mouthing meat is murder or something like that, you know, but the thing is that we mess with each other a lot. You know, I was out grilling right before this. And so, you know, it's just like, it's like yin and yang here. I love it. So anyway, you know, that the other part of what Upton Sinclair wanted to do, because Upton Sinclair was very like left-wing socialist, he wanted to draw attention to the conditions of immigrant poverty. Now, very few people cared about the conditions of immigrant poverty. Now, of course, that's where Jacob Riss, How the Other Half Lives. Okay, so he's another person, kind of a proto muckraker. But the thing is that Congress commissioned an investigation into the meat industry. Now, they weren't just going to take Sinclair's word for it, but once they investigated, they were like, yeah, you know, this stuff's pretty nasty. So you had, during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. And so what the muckrakers were trying to do is they were trying to get the government to act where they saw corruption. Now, Ida Tarbell is another muckraker. Ida Tarbell, you know, basically wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company, which was not a very, like, you know, not very kind to John D. Rockefeller, and drawing attention to things that he did in building his business that she thought were immoral. And one of the results of that was that William Howard Taft prosecuted Standard Oil under antitrust legislation and broke up the Standard Oil Company as a monopoly. Now, you know, let me think as far as that goes. Let's see. There are a few other muckrakers. I'll know it. I'll know it when I see it. Now, of course,
Frank Norris.
Okay, tell me about Frank Norris again. That was the octopus, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. So Frank Norris was a muckraker who wrote about basically from kind of the populist standpoint, the farmer standpoint. A lot of you have asked about populism, right? Populism is this idea of change that begins kind of at the root of, you know, the American floorboards here. So that's Frank Norris giving voice to this by writing The Octopus about the monopolies and the railroads and the overcharging and how farmers are kind of getting screwed. And for every muckraker, you want that effect, because this is a great thesis, right? Stink don't stink until it's in your backyard. You don't know about a problem unless you're informed. And today, a muckraker could be, a Netflix series. It could be a magazine, a comic book. It could be anything that brings light to a problem that creates a want for change. So that's going to lead the octopus to the Hepburn Act, which is going to basically set the maximum rate that railroads can charge farmers. But that's the idea of populism, that farmers are going to start to organize. They're going to organize with things like the Grange and these smaller parties, and that eventually populism will spread to a degree where usually one of the major political parties will absorb by kind of, taking that issue on for themselves. So when Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive Republican, he takes that on as a cause, right? Regulating the monopolies and trust busting and, the FDA and doing all of this stuff. And that kind of co-opts the smaller third parties. Are you going to belong to the Socialist Party as a populist? What are the odds your guy's going to win? Poor Eugene Debs, he could never win. But Teddy Roosevelt and the Republicans, that's a bet that you might want to make. So, Frank Norris and the Octopus.
Yeah, now another one would be Ida B. Wells, sometimes called Ida B. Wells Barnett. And she was writing about lynching in the South and bringing attention to this lynching epidemic, which, brought a lot of awareness, but didn't necessarily cause the government to act. Now, it's funny that Keith said something as far as like Netflix series, because, that 13 Reasons Why series, that's the thing that, so you're thinking about that's like, at least on some level trying to draw attention to, the epidemic of teen suicide and bullying in schools and stuff like that. So, that would be interesting. Now, that would be kind of a creative synthesis if anybody's looking for something like that. If the prompt was right and the thesis was right and all that, that really, that is continuing that tradition of muckraking. Now, of course, since it's entertaining, it's helping Netflix, sell subscriptions and get interest and all that. But it is, at least on paper, it has a social purpose. So, and of course the book as well, as far as that goes. But, people say they've read the book, say it's even more focused on that. But anyway, as far as that goes, those would be muckrakers. So thank you very much, Adrian. Adri, I'm about to send you a promo code. I'll DM you a promo code for my Romulus APUSH review app. Now, one thing about this, as far as that goes, Romulus is tweeting questions right now, is live tweeting some questions. Hopefully we'll get some more soon. But one thing about this, now this is the thing, it's just a simple trivia app. It's just something to put the content in front of you and make sure you know a bunch of stuff when you go in there. So which battle has the distinction of being the bloodiest single day of the Civil War? Now, that is Antietam. Now, there were a lot of people who voted Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, but Antietam was the bloodiest single day. That was a one-day battle. Gettysburg was a three-day battle. So the thing is, it's just a nice way to kind of reinforce that stuff and make sure when you're writing the LEQ and the DBQ that when you're using outside information, you're using the correct outside information and you're using specific outside information. This isn't going to help you much with, multiple choice necessarily, which are more conceptual, but it's going to help you a lot where you have to actually come up with evidence by yourself. So just a little thing like that. And we'll have some more questions that I'll be retweeting from Romulus, the Romulus EDU Twitter account. So as far as that goes, and I'll be tweeting some promo codes for Romulus, not too many because, I want y'all to buy it, but, I'm be tweeting out a few. All right, so Keith, where are we going next?
Hey kids, let's I can't say the name. It's an awesome name. It's like Rabizi Earthy, baby. Rabizi Earthy, whoever you are. Let's talk a little bit about civil rights in the 50s and the 60s and what you need to know, and touch base before that on those earlier African American civil rights leaders that aren't part of that more modern civil rights era. So the three that I generally will throw around before we get to the 50s. Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is kind of the Black nationalism movement, the Back to Africa movement. His philosophy is basically, it's bad. We need to get the heck out. And then you have W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois represents more of the, civil rights now philosophy. He started the Niagara movement, which is going to lead into the NAACP. He wrote in the Crisis, the magazine. He was a law guy, an intellectual. His idea was to get African Americans mobilized legally to get those laws changed because he believed the Constitution sided with him. And then you have the more pragmatic Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, who's not telling African Americans, turn the other cheek and ignore racism, but basically to focus on self-reliance, to get an education, maybe a vocational education, to plant, to farm, to create, to make. That was the best approach, and that civil rights would come, I don't want to say down the road, but civil rights will be easily more obtainable if that was the approach. So you have those three early leaders, Marcus Garvey, W.E. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. And then we're just going to go really quick. I don't want to throw too much vocabulary at you, because many of you are really smart kids and you probably know it. But while there are acts of resistance against Jim Crow, really we're not going to get that organized structure that's going to be able to get attention for themselves until, after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. Now the whole country is watching. So, start with your Montgomery bus boycott, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, that rolling into groups like CORE and SNCC and more kind of in-your-face resistance. It's still nonviolence, but sitting at Woolworth said, you can dump food on me, you can attack me with a dog, I'm not going to fight back, but the world needs to see what Jim Crow looks like. It's kind of almost similar to that muckraking idea theme, that, you can't change what you don't know. That stink don't stink until it's in your backyard. And there's many Northerners, and I'm sure Southerners, that have turned a blind eye to the injustices that are going on. But you can't ignore it when it's on your TV set. When you're faced with that idea that there's a German Shepherd biting an innocent person, that people are being water hosed, that's when public opinion changes. You can't do anything without public opinion. And I think that those leaders, Martin Luther King and the people that ran CORE and SNCC, understood that. And eventually it's going to culminate, before we get legal remedies, with that, of course, I Have a Dream speech in 1963, which shows you that lobbying can work, that organizing at a grassroots level can make changes. And of course, the big change that you guys want to sink your teeth into is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is going to, using interstate commerce, basically ban discrimination in public accommodation places, motels, hotels. So segregation is ending kind of with that. We'll get there. And the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which needed more lobbying. Of course, those marches down south for registration in cause like Selma, which is really important. So I kind of want to stop there, because we can keep going and break SNCC up into the Black Panthers and go with that. But just understanding the very basic idea of civil disobedience and why that worked during that time period. So what do you think, Tom? Go.
All right, I tell you what, Olivia Howell, who is basically, when people get creative, okay, so Olivia Howell went to my Instagram, figured maybe he'll check his Instagram. He's announcing Twitter, he'll do his Instagram. So basically she, put a picture of the review on her Finsta. Then she said, talk about the Cold War. And then on her Rensta, then she said, yes, I agree with her, thinking I may not notice it's the same person. But anyway, she's trying very hard to get an overall explanation of the Cold War, which I think that we've already hit to an extent, Olivia, that we have been talking about some of this stuff already. I'm trying to think of something in the Cold War that we haven't really hit. Now, of course, the Truman Doctrine, containment. Okay, if you see the Truman Doctrine, containment. The Eisenhower Doctrine, now Truman's primarily concerned with Europe and Asia. The Eisenhower Doctrine is about the Middle East. How are we going to reduce Soviet influence in the Middle East? Because what you see is like what we call third world countries, that we associate that with poverty. A lot of these countries are poor countries, but basically these are countries that are part of the non-aligned movement. And so how do we get allies in the Middle East? So Eisenhower says that we will we'll give aid to any nation in the Middle East that is being attacked, okay, that is under threat of attack by a communist country, and ask for military aid, that the United States will give that military aid. So that is the Eisenhower Doctrine. Now, As far as Vietnam, we were talking about some things with Nixon. Now, one thing that Nixon's responsible for in Vietnam is Vietnamization and the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine was that the United States will be willing to give financial support, military equipment support, all kinds of support to countries that are fighting communism, but not ground troops, okay? And that is a response to Vietnam and the excesses there during the Johnson administration, okay? So that's one thing about Nixon Vietnamization. And we were talking about detente, okay? So detente, which is what Nixon does, Nixon goes to China and recognizes for the first time, the U.S. recognizes communist China and starts what has been a very, very big trade relationship, one of our biggest trading partners, if not the biggest, I don't know, not on the exam. But as far as that's that. Now Ford largely continues to talk. There's one picture where Ford is standing next to Brezhnev wearing one of those Russian hats, and Kennedy would not have done that, okay, because that would have been plastered everywhere, and it would have been like you're soft on communism. But during the 1970s, the presidents were trying to just loosen the tensions because it was really stressful for everybody. And so as far as that goes, that's that. Now, Jimmy Carter, human rights, okay, human rights foreign policy. And so Jimmy Carter was like, this is kind of a throwback to Woodrow Wilson. If you want to think about possible comparisons and synthesis, Woodrow Wilson had a more internationalist kind of thing with his moral missionary, like Woodrow Wilson, moral missionary. Okay, that's what I think. WWMM, just like Big Bill's dollar diplomacy, William Howard Taft dollar diplomacy. Now, as far as that goes, you've got Jimmy Carter, human rights, and Jimmy Carter's big thing was like the Camp David Accords you had between Israel and Egypt. That was his big foreign policy success. Now, his big foreign policy failure was, of course, the Iran hostage crisis. That was just a complete mess. So as far as that goes, that's important. But then Reagan, that's where Reagan comes in. And, Reagan is now he's a conservative. And he's like, look, we don't need to make nice with communism. Reagan brings back that whole like very anti-communist, mentality, hardline. Let's build up the military, peace through strength. Okay. And, on one occasion, now, of course, part of Reagan's rise was the mobilization of the religious right, evangelical Christians as as an interest group, as a voting bloc. And so Reagan, gave a speech to evangelicals, the evil empire speech. And he reminded those evangelicals, he's like, look, we're fighting people who don't believe in God. Reagan got like all parts of his coalition on board with this rollback plan of his. Okay. And then, of course, that included rolling back communism in Latin America, where, basically a leftist regime had taken over in Nicaragua. So the Reagan administration decided, hey, let's quietly sell arms to Iran illegally, and the money we get from that, we're going to send to the Contras in Nicaragua against like Congress's instructions. And so basically, it's like about rolling back communism. Now, of course, in Latin America, containment. Now, Cuba is the biggest like failure of containment there. There are a couple of organizations that were founded. The Organization of American States, which is kind of like a United Nations for the Americas. And, they kicked Cuba out of that organization on its charter, on its original charter. Part of the thing for the Organization of American States, part of the mission was to stop the spread of Marxism, Leninism in the Americas. Now, the other thing is the Alliance for Progress. This was created by Kennedy. You had the Alliance for Progress, which was about giving economic aid to Latin America. Now, what are you thinking? What does this sound kind of like? Oh, yeah, this sounds kind of like the Marshall Plan in Europe under Truman. So the Alliance for Progress was something, let's give the Latin American countries economic aid so that, they're less likely to turn to communism. And so those are some things. I hope that helped you, Olivia. And Emma McLaughlin wanted a shout out. So some of you Instagram folks, let's see if we've got any new Instagram followers. So David Creighton, give him a shout out there. 118, Jordan Dove, Sydney Trim, Lulu Foo 888. Love some of these handles. Maurice PR 41, Sebastian the Crab 14, 8110, 810 Will, Catherine 31, Starry Night, something like that with X's in it. Okay, thank you so much for the Instagram follows, ladies and gentlemen. So I did a little bit more with Latin American relations. Now, somebody asked for imperialism. Somebody's asking for Latin American relations. Now, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, James Monroe. That James Monroe and his administration said, you know, this was a time when there were a lot of revolutions in Latin America against European powers. And so basically, in case the European powers want to come back in and take it, you know, take Latin America back, what happened here was that, you know, what you end up seeing here is that the Monroe Doctrine says that the United States does not support any further colonization by European powers. Now, the United States at that time didn't really have any force, you know, any way to force that or anything. The British happened to agree with it and kind of cooperated with us. But the thing is that, you know, that was the Monroe Doctrine. Now, when Teddy Roosevelt comes in, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the corollary is a logical extension. And so as far as a corollary is concerned, you know, he says basically, well, you know what? The Monroe Doctrine, the whole point is to limit European influence in Latin America. And so what he does is he says, look, we're kind of like Latin America's parent. Like if a European country is owed money by a Latin American country, the United States will get involved. Like tell the United States, we'll collect it. Don't you go over there and collect it, because that's kind of like colonization. Okay. So, you know, you don't go collect it. Tell us, we'll collect it. And so imperialism, now, of course, there's a lot of resentment there, which is why under Herbert Hoover and FDR, you know, you start to see the good neighbor policy where the United States, you know, basically backs away from imperialism. Now, Cuba in particular, when the United States supported Cuban independence, there was the Teller Amendment, go to Cuba and tell her we don't want her. You know, that's to, you know, we don't want to annex Cuba. But then the Platt Amendment put restrictions on Cuba. So Cuba could not enter into alliances without our consent. Cuba, you know, basically, if there was any kind of you know, insurrection or riot, the United States could go in and crush that. That we had the perpetual naval lease at Guantanamo Bay. So those are some things that I would kind of sum up with Latin American relations. And of course, there's the Cuban Revolution and all that comes along with that, Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, and everything. Now, let's go ahead and Hip Hughes, tag your it, and maybe you can go for a little extended run because, yeah, I'm kind of out of breath.
There's a lot of stuff on the test, guys. Let's do a quick run up to the Civil War just to get our major vocab down. And then maybe, Tom, you could prepare for French and Indian. There's a whole bunch of kids asking for that. So if I do Civil War, we can go back and we can gangster ride a little bit of the 18th century, and I'll do a little bit of the 19th century for the kiddies here. So I would start with the idea that, you know, this has been in the news recently. You know, what's the Civil War about, right? With the idea that the Civil War is as much about the expansion of slavery than the institution of slavery itself. And that if you can look at it through that viewpoint, that manifest destiny, almost like a zipper opening the country in half as we bring it westward, you could see the country kind of dividing. So coming up with a plan or band-aids is sectionalism, right? These band-aids to try to heal that wound that is ripping the country open. I think that's the best analogy or kind of way I can visualize it for you. So Congress is going to start putting band-aids on as early as 1820. In 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise. This is going to basically create an invisible line, you know, across the country, going east to west in order to solve that problem. So basically the idea was, if we divide the country in half and we have 13 free states and 13 slave states, then we can all get along for, you know, forever. But of course, as new states come in, disturb that lineage, and we're going to have to get other compromises as we go along. And of course, annexation of Texas, the Mexican War, you know, California, all these, you know, territories are coming into the country. You know, this is still on the front stove as we go into 1850. Make sure you know the compromise of 1850. 1850 is going to bring California in as a free state. I believe Maine is a free state as well, if I want to say that correctly. But the big thing is
Missouri Compromise.
What's that?
You're thinking Missouri Compromise.
California, I do Compromise of 1850s. California and who?
Just California. See, here's the thing. Now, Keith, I'll just kind of set you up and get back to you. Okay. So Missouri Compromise, that's where they're still admitting one slave state, one free state, one slave state, one free state. Now, the
California, right. So California being so large is going to upset that balance.
Yeah. And the free soil movement.
Right. So the big concept is that we're going to try to use popular sovereignty as the remedy after 1850, rather than trying to figure out new ways every time we get new states. We'll just go back to the basics of republicanism. We'll allow the settlers of that state, that territory, to decide for themselves if they want slavery or if they want to be a free soil. And that really, sets up kind of a competitive system between the North and the South. It would almost be like if you wanted to, move somewhere and have two gangs move somewhere and go, we're going to have a popular election of which gang is going to rule the roost. You're probably going to have some drive-bys, if you know what I mean. So the biggest example or the best example or the illustration of that idea that popular sovereignty isn't the magic bullet, but in fact is going to cause more conflict, more tension, more movement towards a civil war, of course, is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which brings popular sovereignty there. And that's going to bring people like radical abolitionists in order to try to win that territory state, like John Brown. So that's bringing us closer and closer to the Civil War. And of course, John Brown, the radical abolitionist, is eventually going to lead a raid at Harper's Ferry, where he's going to try with just a few of his friends to overthrow the system of slavery in the South and spark that Civil War. Of course, he is tried for treason. He is executed. But again, it's that stink don't stink idea. As people start to, kind of see John Brown in the North as a martyr, that's going to grow those voices of abolitionism. But I'm going to stick to my thesis that those voices of abolitionism weren't being sung from the inside of the halls of power, but right on the outside of the halls of power. But the Southern governments, they just hear the music of abolitionism. So that's why the election of Lincoln, even though Lincoln isn't talking about the abolition of slavery. He's certainly a free soiler. He certainly wants to stop it from spreading, but he is seen in the viewpoint of he's one of them. And it's the election of Lincoln, which of course is the trigger, which is going to release those Southern states. They're going to start seceding as soon as he's elected. What a horrible way to walk into office, right? You walk into office, everyone's like, I quit the team. So if you want to blame somebody, can we just blame James Buchanan? How about poor James Buchanan, who is seen or consistently ranked as one of the least popular or least effective presidents because, he's in that rock and hard place. He's a Democrat. What do you do? What do you do but just kind of sit and watch the boat head for the iceberg, which is what I guess he ended up doing. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that. That was kind of a rush job on the Civil War, but really understanding the idea of manifest destiny, the expansion of slavery, leading to all of those band-aids, those failed compromises, eventually to the outbreak of violence with Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, and then, secession itself. Tom.
Yeah, I think you've done a great job there, especially like one of the big things here is abolitionism versus free soil. All right. And so, when you're looking at that, the free soilers like Lincoln are saying, we don't want slavery to expand. I don't want my backyard. They wanted a white West. They wanted the West to be, small, independent, white farmers. That's what they had in mind. And so, which the South at the same time saw that, these are, that slavery needs to expand in order to survive. Now, of course, a lot of things start upsetting the balance here because in the Compromise of 1850, they get away from this tradition of having a free state and a slave state. So the South is starting to find ways, how can we expand? And so basically, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, this is the principle of popular sovereignty, which had been applied before in the, in the Mexican cession. Well, we're going to apply popular sovereignty now in Kansas and Nebraska. Now, the thing about Kansas and Nebraska is those were territories within the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise, that was supposed to be closed to slavery. So basically, Congress rescinds in those areas the Missouri Compromise and what had come to that. So you start to see the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They take a deal that had already been made. The Democrats overplay their hand because they see the Whig Party is falling apart. But what happens here is the Kansas-Nebraska Act generates so much outrage in the North, especially among these free soilers, that you've got momentum for the Republican Party to form. And that's part of, when you look at the causes of the Civil War, the breakup of the second party system really can't be understated here, because the Republicans, they form a sectional party, a party that's really got like no pretension of being a national party. And so then, it gets a lot of movement to where the North, the free states are speaking by 1860 with one voice. And of course, the Democrats not speaking with one voice because, they can't figure out who to elect, who to nominate, because Stephen Douglas, Lincoln trapped him into saying something to keep his Senate seat. And then Stephen Douglas was unpalatable to the South, which was basically a death sentence for a Democratic candidate at that time. And so Stephen Douglas basically said that, well, I guess settlers in the West, if they didn't want slavery, they could ignore Dred Scott. And so that basically made him anathema for the South, that like, no, absolutely not. We can't have this guy who says that, Dred Scott's, not the law of the land. And of course, Dred Scott was a big rallying cry for free soilers. When Lincoln gave his House divided speech, this was about Dred Scott, where he said, look, what's to stop if the Supreme Court can legislate this for territories? What's to stop them from saying that to a state, that a state has to allow slaves in? And so Lincoln and other politicians are really able to use this anger from Dred Scott, to help the Republican Party to grow into an electable force. And so as far as that goes, I think that would kind of, give you a fair, review of a lot of events leading up to the Civil War. And remember the Wilmot Proviso, which was an attempted legislative expression of free soil, that the Mexican Cession will be closed to slavery. Of course, it didn't pass, but it was still very important because the free soilers are saying this is what our position is. And this whole thing, like of the Henry Clay generation, it's done. This whole compromise thing, it's over. In the 1850s, anything but compromise. All right, Keith, what you got next for us?
I could do a little bit of the French and Indian War, but a brother's going to hook me up, so I'll do half and then see where I'm missing a little bit of the loop. Don't know. I'm an instructional technology coach, so doing the YouTube videos, but I haven't been in the classroom every day yelling this content. But if I was doing French and Indian War, I'd remind myself first that the French and Indian War is as much as a global war, the 7-year war, as it is also a localized event. So you want to see it in a world war conflict kind of perspective, that this is really the French versus the British. And really, it's about a land grab. You have colonists who want to move westward, right? Of the 13 colonies, Virginians and Tennesseans and people that are looking westward that want to go westward. But of course, the farther west you go, the more you're going to bump your head up against Native Americans. And that's a big pain in the butt for Great Britain, because they're the ones that have to provide the defense. They're the ones that have to solve the problem. So basically, the French and Indian War is kind of that coming together of French expansion and colonial expansion, really centered around Pittsburgh. What's the stupid fort, Fort Duquesne or something? Do you remember, Tom?
Fort Duquesne, you're talking about? That's
the one.
It's all French. It's all French.
How about I do this with the French accent? I do know that George Washington, I can't do that, that it ended up being almost like an accident how the war started, with Washington as a scout and near that fort. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really a battle about the British protecting us against the French, and eventually us winning and able to claim that area and move westward. But at the same time, there's going to be consequences. And this is really, I think, the most important thing about the French and Indian War. It's not about the battles and knowing all of the alliances with which Native American tribes were, which sides, because some of them split loyalties and such. But it's the effect that after that war, the British, they're going to want to get paid. They're going to want to, number one, have troops readily available. So they're going to want to start to station troops in the colonies. That's not a very popular idea, right? Having military occupation, these guys in red coats walking around. And they're also going to have to raise taxes. And that's where you hear taxes. I know what you're saying. You're like, he's going to say no taxation without representation. Yeah, sure. But for the British,
can I interrupt you real quick?
Yes, sir.
Okay, those of you who are emailing me, like, no, I'm not going to any question that's submitted by email. Absolutely not. Okay, my email box is a mess right now. Okay, email is for business. All right, so please do not email me. I will not answer any questions submitted by email. Okay, just letting you know that any question submitted by email will be ignored. So please stick to social media. So just to let you know, I'm seeing some people come in. It's like if you're in a group, please stop. Okay. It's not gonna happen. And it's not cool to use somebody's email in general, that's like, just to spam somebody's email. Sorry about that, Keith. Just wanted to make sure that if that's something a group of people was trying to do, that it doesn't continue.
I can use my teacher voice and yell at them. What do you think you're doing? If you do it one more time, I'm sending you to the office and I'm going to call your mom. All right, guys. So major idea is going to be after the French and Indian War. The British are going to have to raise taxes. They're going to have to station troops. So really the French and Indian War, although it's a victory, yay, we win. At the end of the day, we're sowing the seeds for the actual revolution, right? Where French and Indian War, 1763. So we're about 14 years off, something like that. So all of the events that you associate with the revolution, with the Stamp Act and all that stuff is really to the French and Indian War. What do you think, Tom? You got one? I mean, I could do another one.
Like the French and Indian War is an anchor, okay? Because, I mean, there's actually been an LEQ before. The French and Indian War is a turning point. So the thing is, the biggest thing that the French and Indian War, represents is the end of the policy of salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect, usually when we think neglect, we think bad. But when it comes down to it, if it was like prom weekend and your parents are like, hey, you know what? We've just always, this weekend be great for us to go on a vacation. We're going to leave $200 on the counter. Don't throw any parties or anything. Wink, wink. And make sure the house is clean when we get back. Now, that is salutary neglect. It's going to be lit at your place after prom. And, that the thing is yet lit with like a APUSH study session, right? Because prom was so close to AP. And so the thing is that is good neglect, where basically Britain was like, hey, we passed the Navigation Acts, but we're not going to enforce them. Y'all just trade with whoever you want, even though we've got the laws on the books. So the Navigation Acts, that's the legal expression of mercantilism, okay? The control of trade, the centralized control of trade by the state, which is mercantilism. And so the thing is, though, that, salutary neglect, it's like we're not going to do that. Now, after the French and Indian War, then it's like, well, you know what? Britain's in a lot of debt because of a war that, they really, to some extent, blamed on the colonists, because the colonists were going out west to the Ohio River Valley. And, that was something that was seen as like, we're trying to get this new land. Now, of course, after the war, the proclamation 1763. So basically, the parents come home and they come home with a vengeance. So it's like they left you alone prom weekend and they come back and they're like, let me have your phone. Let me have your keys. All right. Or you can start paying your car note or something like that. And so the thing is, the British are trying to station troops in the colonies that are really not needed, because the French, that's another thing, that the French is a colonial power in North America. As a result of the French and Indian War, done. Okay, they're done. And so as far as that goes, that's a big turning point, because then you've got the three taxes. Now, it's great when you have things you can remember in threes, because that's how the brain works. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. Now, the Sugar Act, this was technically a tax decrease. But, what happened was they cut the tax in half, but now they're actually going to enforce it. So it was a tax that nobody was really collecting, and now they're collecting. It's kind of like if you're driving and the police officer pulled you over for going 57 and a 55, that's, 57 to 55, you would just be like, what? Of course, you just be like, okay, officer, whatever. But inside, you're like, what? because you expect to have some leeway. And so now it's almost like, you know what, now we're going to enforce the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, 56, and you're going to be pulled over. And so the colonists didn't react to that very well. Now, also, if you were caught smuggling, you would be brought before an admiralty court. You would be denied a trial by jury, and they could basically take your ship like in a military court. And so as far as that goes, you've got, you've got that. And then the Stamp Act. Now, the thing about the Stamp Act is while the Sugar Act ticked some people off, nobody disputed Parliament's ability to tax imports. But the Stamp Act was a direct tax on legal documents. So anything from like a diploma or, a bill of sale for land or something like that. All official paper had, all official agreements had to be on this legal paper with a stamp on it that showed that you had paid the tax on that legal transaction. And so the colonists said, you don't have, who do you think you are? What gives you the right? And so, basically that they don't have the right to tax, they don't have the right to tax internally, that only their colonial legislatures can do that. And so that was the tradition that Parliament during that time of salutary neglect, they had never taxed the colonies directly. And so that was, that was a big, big sticking point there. And of course, the Stamp Act was eventually repealed because the colonists were boycotting British goods. Of course, the Sons of Liberty and other groups were also tarring and feathering tax collectors, causing them to resign, causing other acts of like mob violence and such. But mainly the London merchants were like, hey, people aren't buying our stuff. It's like your Washingtons and your Jeffersons. Now they're going around in homespun suits instead of imported suits. And it's kind of cool. It's like those of you who go to the thrift store, not because you can't afford to shop somewhere else, but you're like, oh, this is like hip and trendy or whatever. And
I can't afford it.
Yeah.
I go there because I can't afford it.
Yeah, and so y'all make sure to watch the ads when you watch his videos tonight, okay? So as far as that goes, then you've got the Townshend Acts, a tax on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And so the Townshend Acts, of course, there was also some grumbling about that, and so Parliament ended up repealing the Stamp Act, and then later repealing the Townshend Acts, except for the tax on tea, because Parliament wanted to make a point. We can tax, okay? And so then it just kind of calms down. And then you've got the Boston Massacre. Now, this is all 1760s. Sometimes it's helpful to remember decades. So 1754 to 63, French and Indian War. Then the rest of the 1760s, you're dealing with the Proclamation line. You're dealing with taxes, okay? And then, from 1770, that's the Boston Massacre. Then 1773, you've got the Tea Act. And then, of course, the Boston Tea Party. And Parliament really cracks down after that. They passed the coercive acts, which are called in the colonies the intolerable acts. And these acts, first of all, closed down the Boston Port. Okay, the Boston Port Act closed down the Boston Port. Then, as far as till the tea was paid for, then they put Massachusetts under martial law with the Massachusetts Government Act. Massachusetts would not have a citizen legislature anymore, and they'd be governed by a general. Then you've got, the Quartering Act that, now, instead of saying that, the British could, like the community would have to provide quarters, now the British military can actually commandeer quarters. Now, depending on what you read, that's, at least warehouses and stuff, privately owned warehouses. Some of the things you read say private homes. I've seen, this is kind of disputed, I think, how much soldiers were actually in people's homes, but they were in privately owned buildings that were commandeered by the British. And then, then you have the Administration of Justice Act, which said that, the British soldiers or British officials that were accused of a crime, they would be returned to Britain for trial, which offended a lot of people in the colonies because they gave the Boston Massacre guys a fair trial. They exonerated them. And then finally, there was the Quebec Act, which basically gave Quebec some extra territory, expanded some of their liberties. It allowed them to collect taxes to support the Catholic Church. Now, of course, from the English Bill of Rights, and around that time, like Catholicism was not very popular in the in the colonies, which were overwhelmingly Protestant. And so then you've got this this whole cycle that's just going, you know, Continental Congress, Lexington Concord, and then later on, you know, the Declaration of Independence, which didn't happen immediately. And then Thomas Paine's like, hey, what's going on here? And then finally they do that. So, you know, that's kind of like a little primer on the events leading to the American Revolution. All right, Keith, give me a little relief here.
A little bit of relief from Mr. Thomas Richey. Let's talk about a theme or a thesis. A big idea, and then we'll skip across generations. See if we can figure out how to tie the big idea together, synthesize it. So I love this thesis. When you know what hits the fan, someone's going to lose their rights. I can't curse, so I'm not going to say it. But when the blank hits the fan, this idea of crisis and civil rights, that when you have some type of crisis in the United States, there is this kind of idea that law and order trumps liberty, right? Someone's liberty is going to be lessened because of that crisis. So if we take 3 or 4 examples, and this actually originated out of somebody asking about McCarthyism, and it just got my brain thinking about, well, sure, we could talk about McCarthyism, but this idea of the Red Scare creating the conditions which led to the erosion of civil liberties of people that were associated with radical groups like communism and socialists is a bigger idea than McCarthyism, right? They wrote a book about it. It's called The Crucible, so I would start like with Civil War. So if you do Civil War and you're thinking about, all right, that's a crisis. What's the connector, Mr. Hughes? Where can I go? Who lost their rights? Well, there were plenty of Southerners, especially Southerners in border states, because these border states are in the Union, right? Kentucky is in the Union. West Virginia is in the Union. And as being in the Union, you would assume that everybody should have their basic rights, like, I don't know, habeas corpus rights, such like that. But because of the crisis of the Civil War, Lincoln is going to allow himself to suspend the rights of many of those white Southerners that are living in Union states and just lock them up, throw them away for a little while. Their rights, their liberty is going to be seen as, okay, we can dilute their liberty. It's more important that we don't let them try to succeed or start a rebellion, something like that. So their rights go down. And then as we go through conflicts, we can go into World War I. We have the Palmer raids. We have decisions like Schenck versus Schenck versus U.S., where we're going to start to basically limit the rights of people that are seen as possibly being anti-war, getting in the way of the war movement, or socialist, or that sort of thing. The next one is World War II, and that's a huge one for Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The court case Korematsu versus United States, the Supreme Court okayed that we're going to strip you of your habeas corpus. We have no reason to lock you up, to arrest you, to take away your liberty, other than we think you might one day maybe be a spy. That's erosion of liberty. When blank hits the fan, those Japanese Americans took it on the chin. And then the Red Scare. This gets to this idea of McCarthyism, of somebody, what do you want to say? Of somebody taking advantage of that crisis for maybe their own personal reasons. Joseph McCarthy had his own political ambitions. He might have been a little bit of a drinker, if you know what I mean. But he's going to start accusing people with very little evidence. But because of that time period, because of the fear of communism, an accusation was enough for many people to, okay, maybe they are a witch. Maybe they are a communist. Maybe they are a terrorist. Maybe they are a rebel. That allows for those conditions. Now, of course, Joseph McCarthy is going to be his own worst enemy, and he's going to go too far, eventually accusing, members of the army of being, communists, and he's going to have his bubble popped. But, we got HUAC out of that, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, right? I'm not sure how you can be un-American. You're either an American or you're not American. But some people are un-American. Who are those people going to be? And again, they're using this fear of communism. They took down and accused people and ruined careers. Pete Seeger and Langston Hughes. I think Lucille Ball was called up, Arthur Miller, Burl Ives, John Garfield, the great director. These people's lives were destroyed because of an accusation. And why was that allowed to happen? Because it was a climate of fear. And during climates of fear, whether it's an accusation or a law, like, the executive order that locked up those Japanese Americans. We just have to be careful and kind of look back in American history, knowing that those circumstances do sometimes lead to a soft erosion of people's liberties. So sink your teeth into that. I know that Tom's got something for you.
All right. What have I got, Keith? Okay, so let's see about that.
I got a couple more, but I'll let you go.
All right, let's see. I would say something to this young man who keeps emailing me, but I'm not going to give him the dignity of using his name.
Oh, don't let him get you hot under the collar there.
Oh, yes, yeah. Oh, no. We're good. We're good. Now I am getting some good stuff on Twitter here. You know, as far as that goes, Keith, it looks like there is some demand for us to get into some alphabet soup. Now we are going to be closing this down in a little bit. Now, one thing, I am going to be going into a premium fireside chat after this. Okay, we've still got some spots now. Like I was saying earlier, the fireside chat, I'm only opening that up to 50 people tops. We've got like almost 4,000 people in here right now. So the people that are in the fireside chat, it's limited to 50 people. It's going to be for an hour and a half. And I think that I've got like 10 to 15. Yeah, I've got 15 spots left in the fireside chat. So I got that idea from FDR. So that's going to be happening in a little bit. But Keith, now one thing I tell you, somebody mentioned on Twitter, Keith's exam night meditation. That's something, Keith, let's talk about the New Deal agencies a little bit, and then let's kind of preview your exam meditation. It's one of my favorite videos, and really those of you on the East Coast, as far as this fireside chat cram session, please go to bed, okay? Please go to bed. You know, but there are people that are in like Mountain Time, California, Pacific Time, that, you know, it's still kind of early. They still want to get some studying in. That's why I'm offering this fireside chat to have something like that. But please, if you're on the East Coast, like, you know, go to bed. I'm not trying to keep people up late the night before the exam. So as far as FDR's alphabet soup, Keith, you have a few you want to put out there, and I'll maybe throw in a few.
I want to go through a few, and then if you can't get into Tom's Hangout, I just want to remind you of just the video arsenals, man. There's tons of stuff, but I agree with Tom. It's just crazy not to get sleep. I mean, who do you think you are? You think you're not a human being? So make sure you go to bed on time. And and when I'm done with a couple of these programs, maybe I'll screen share, show you where the meditation video is. It's a little bit creepy. I'm going to admit, just a little bit creepy. I'm in my pajamas for a few minutes, but basically, I used to ask these kids in my class, how many people, you know, have trouble falling asleep? And every time I asked that question, half the room would put their hands up in the air. So I'm a little bit weird. You know, I'm a vegetarian, so I have to be a little bit weird. So I believe in, you know, different types of breathing exercises and visualization. So I basically teach you how to self-meditate, how to fall asleep. And as I do that, I kind of slip in some subliminal stuff about United States history. Nothing creepy, but the whole kind of video is creepy, I'm going to admit. So let's just do a few.
Okay, you're going to say creepy, Keith, but it's very relaxing. Like, I mean, if you just kind of embrace it, like, it's the relaxation you need, and it's really awesome. Y'all should all try it. All right, so Keith,
I'm going to do a podcast version because I got a nice new mic, and people probably don't want to watch it. You can't watch it when you're falling asleep. So anyway, so for the New Deal, and of course, know the basic idea behind the Great Depression, right? The 1920s, you have margin buying, you have overproduction of farming goods, you have, you know, consumerism, too much credit, Black Friday, the market crashes. You have Hoover, and we're not going to get into it. Like, did he do enough? Did he not do enough? What is the real reasons? You know, you can think about that all day and night. But at the end of the day, the American people are going to blame Hoover for inaction, even though he is doing things. He is doing some infrastructure spending. He is working with tariffs, different things to try to save the economy. But when FDR comes in, he comes in with a mandate, a huge mandate, because it's such a huge electoral victory, and he's coming in with a Senate and a Congress. So in his first 100 days, like, we talk now about the 100 days, and they're like, ooh, they voted in the House, and they got the bill passed in there. I mean, FDR in the first 100 days, I don't know, Bill, I think he passed like 20 laws or something. It was crazy. Probably a little bit too fast for the founders. But anyway, let's just talk about maybe 5 of them really quick, right? And 2 of them are special because you need to know the unconstitutional ones, because that's going to lead to court packing, and then you're getting into kind of this check and balance thing and bigger ideas. But I always hate doing this one. I'll tell you the story because I'm getting tired and I don't care. But I actually had a guy in my room when I was teaching this one year. And when I taught the Tennessee Valley Authority, I do not want to offend one person out there, but I would just kind of do that a little bit. And I would go, you know, I live in Tennessee. I don't have lots yet. I would like a job. And I wasn't trying to be offensive. I just wanted my kids to associate the accident of TVA with a Southern accent. So when I was done with that, the kids left, and the guy who was fixing the computers comes up and he goes, I would just like you to know I'm from the great state of Tennessee. And then he walked out. So I was like, oh, man. But the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to be a specific program, which is really state-run but federal dollars, which is going to create dams in that Appalachian Valley in order to create, number one, jobs. That's pump spending. You're putting money right into the economy, but also modernizing it and creating a better business kind of atmosphere for economic growth. So we're not going to judge whether these worked or not, because Tom is right. He talked about this before. If anything, these programs are stopping the bleeding. But it is going to be World War II and all those jobs that's going to get us out of the Great Depression for show. The CCC is another easy one, I think, to remember, because I always just think city, 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 CCC. Or you could do city, country, city. Because the idea was you have a lot of unemployment in urban areas, and you have a lot of parents who can't feed themselves. So what if we took these kids out of the city, put them in a rural area, had them do work like build bridges and parks and comb beaches and help the environment, get them out of that environment, send that money back home so mom and dad and the grandparents can feed themselves. So that's a program with multiple avenues of trying to kind of patch these holes in society that are bleeding out without a safety net, right? There's no real strong safety net. So when everyone loses their savings and the bank money is gone and you have no job, there has to be somewhere to fall. That's the philosophy. WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration, you're hiring at this point artists for billboards. And this is where it starts to get a little bit fishy in a lot of people's minds, because in a sense, you're using government money to promote the government in a sense. But these are all unemployment programs, money going back into the economy, trying to fix those very basic problems. But here's where FDR went too far. He went too far in the eyes of the Supreme Court with the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and with the NRA, the National Recovery Act. The National Recovery Act actually would try to set prices on goods under the idea that chickens in Pennsylvania were laying eggs that were being sold in New Jersey. So because they cross state lines, that's interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court's going to be like, whoa, dude, that's just cray-cray. That's just too much of a stretch. And that's what leads FDR to really argue that Congress, because he controls Congress, to add more Supreme Court seats. How about that? You don't like the Supreme Court ruling? Hire more refs. That'll be the best way ever to do it. And that's where the country says no. That's where we're going to, you've seen those political cartoons of the steps to dictatorship. So that's really, really fast. But I'm getting so tired, Tom. I'm going to flip on my screen share and give it back to Tom to do whatever he needs to do. And then I'll say goodbye when he's done. But if I could just hit my screen share button for a second really quick. We're going to share out my entire screen. I'm just going to go to, this is on my Twitter, guys. If you're looking for like a list of stuff, I have this 114 ways to pass the exam. That's actually the meditation video right there. So if I open that up really quickly for you, exam preparation, there it is. Unfortunately, I'm going to come in with my pajamas. That's a little bit creepy. But if I go to hiphughes.com, this is what I want to show you if you want to get maybe a half hour of studying in and pick some strategic videos, because we didn't cover everything. I think you know that. Hit the video arsenal button, and then 2 links. Number 1, actually 3. The entire U.S. history curriculum for the most part. Pick a couple topics that you're weak with. And then if you go all the way to the bottom, you can see DBQs and different reviews. Go back to the arsenal. Many of you were asking about important elections. So if you want to sink your teeth into some elections, we have every election from George Washington all the way to Obama's second election. And the last one I'm going to show you is we haven't talked a lot about different pieces of the Constitution because this isn't a real government course, but you'll recognize stuff in here that you probably are going to want to know something about, whether it's a couple important amendments like the 17th that you can connect to the progressive era, and the 16th Amendment, by the way, as well, and the 19th, but also things like the Elastic Clause, so you can explain things like the National Bank and McCulloch versus Maryland. So I'm going to go and stop this screen share right now, and I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm going to stand here and listen to Tom, but I'm going to turn it over to him right now.
All right, that's right. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Keith. And, you know, we're about to go to the kind of the upper room. That might have been, you know, almost sacrilegious to some. But now, Keith, nice Tennessee accent, by the way. I'm going to tell you, like, as far as Southern accents go, you did Tennessee decently well for a Northerner. But as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I am limiting access to the Fireside chat because, like FDR, that's going to be more, you know, more casual, just more me with a smaller group of people. That's what I wanted. I could decide to open that up to more people, but I really just, you know, I want that to be something that is a smaller gathering. But Keith's got all kinds of videos. I've got the Romulus app. Now, the thing is, it's a trivia app. Okay. Some people are like, they think that they're paying like $3.99. We've lowered the price to $3.99. They think they're paying $3.99 and it's going to give them the same value as like a $20 prep book or something like that. And it's like you're buying a $3.99 app. Okay. It's trivia. It's to help you see, do you know the content? Yes, some of the questions are specific. People act like they don't need no specific knowledge for your LEQ, DBQ. You need specific knowledge. You know, as much as this exam is saying that like this is conceptual, it is conceptual. But the thing is, like, what do you call the person who understands a concept but doesn't have any facts to back it up? That person's an idiot. I mean, that's really, it's like that's a person that doesn't know what they're talking about. And there are research studies that have come out recently. The people who know the basic trivial information, they do better on tests. Like, that's the thing. So when it comes down to it, like, studying trivia is studying for the test. You know, now you want to know the test format and all that, but people, they always want shortcuts. And so, you know, we're giving you a way to prepare for this exam. And so the Romulus app, of course, POV me, I designed the app. I'm going to improve it some next year. I've gotten some feedback. I want to improve it. But excuse me, the thing is 800 trivia questions that are basically just kind of, hey, like, let's get your U.S. history knowledge up there. So I'm going to the Fireside chat, but you know, you've got the app. If you don't want to spend any money tonight, that's the thing. Like, Keith and I have videos. You know, I've got that APUSH review page that I posted. Keith's got, you know, a page with all kinds of stuff. So the thing is, now remember, don't stay up too late, okay? And that's where you want to go into the POV. You got Keith here with his stuffed R2. Oh, go ahead, Keith. Show him your R2D2 one more time. That is the cutest thing. All right, he's got the say something, Keith.
Make sure you get enough sleep tonight because R2D2 has an old man's voice.
And he's a Muppet. I think you made a Muppet at R2D2. All right, so as far as that goes, we do say, like, at some point, go to bed because sleep is important. And, you know, so the thing is, but if you're on the West Coast, if you're in Mountain Time, keep watching our videos. Remember to watch the ads. Buy my app. Of course, I'm saying that because I made it. But I think it's valuable. And that's the thing. People who know the material do better on exams. Bottom line, okay? That's the thing. So as far as that goes, thank y'all so much for another AP season. Now, keep in mind that Keith and I do stuff for AP Government. So if you're taking AP Government next year, we're not done. Keith and I do a review for AP Government every year, and that's going to be great. It's going to be lit. Keith has so many videos for AP Government. Like,
guys,
it's
don't
great.
Don't keep us a secret, man. Like, tell your friends in school and share it on social media. You know, as long as you don't get beat up because you're too much of a nerd sharing academic stuff on social media. But you know, tell your teachers because, you know, we want to get the word out there. Absolutely. And I'm going to finish what I have to say with something I say at the end of all my videos. It's kind of my mantra of how I live my life. I try to remember, guys, where attention goes, energy flows. So control your attention and be good. And thanks for watching. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and I'm done.
And as much as I didn't like people like emailing me, there was one person, I said I wasn't going to call anybody out, but one person said, I bought your app. And so I'm like, thank you so much, whoever this is. So this is Toby. I'm just going to go ahead and give you a shout out, Toby. And Toby, I don't know if you're the same person who sent me a message that said, hit that dab. Now, I will hit that dab if you will just please stop emailing me, okay? Like, seriously, please stop emailing me. But, you know, for whatever reason, people like the dab. I'm going to hold it for a second. So if you want a screenshot or something like that, you know, we can do that, okay? So I'm going to hit that dab. All right. So anyway, okay, so I guess that's kind of a tradition there. I hit the dab. Thank you for buying the app. And it has been a pleasure tonight. Always a pleasure. Take a look at the stuff we've got out there. And in a few minutes, I will go into the fireside chat, FDR style. It's always a pleasure, APUSH.